Greetings and welcome once again to Aspects of Aliyah, brought to you from an extremely cold and blustery day in the UK. In the second of what will now be 4 sessions, we're going to look at the whole issue of eschatology again. In the second session, the subject is apocalyptic writing. This will be session 2 of what will now be 4 sessions. Session 3 will be concerning Gog and Magog, and section 4 will be concerning Armageddon. So we've got quite an interesting couple of sessions ahead. There won't be any charts, diagrams, forecasts, prophetic words, attempted timings, attempted identities of the Antichrist or anything like this. We're simply going to look at what the Bible teaches about the end times and how this affects the Jewish people. Eschatology really has been a great tool of disservice to Israel and the Jewish people. In the evangelical world, it's been used very much to prop up anti-Semitism and replacement theology. However, as we go along, we'll see that the whole issue, particularly in the book of Revelation, we'll look at a very stylized Jewish document that really does concern the future of Israel and the Jewish people and the church and Christians as well. But we need to understand that these documents that we're going to be looking at are primarily Jewish documents addressed to the Jewish people. It comes as a great surprise to a lot of people to know in the book of Revelation, there are over 500 allusions, not quotes, allusions to Old Testament scriptures. Some scholars suggest it's probably nearer 1,000, but some of these are not quite as direct as others. In addition, there are allusions to other Jewish non-canonical writings. Might surprise you to know that of all the verses in Revelation, 68% are allusions to Old Testament scriptures. In particular, the book of Ezekiel, Isaiah, Daniel, and a multitude of others. So, Revelation, sometimes called the Apocalypse, is drawn from the Greek term apocalypsis, which is literally lifting the veil. And it was described as being in a theatre and the curtains being pulled back, because you really don't know what's behind it initially. Apocalypse, in modern parlance, has developed a number of meanings and is frequently used to express a disaster or a catastrophic event leading to widespread destruction or even fantastical, the end of the age, such as a nuclear conflagration. In the scriptures and associated writings, it carries the direct meaning of the Greek word apocalypse, if you want. Now, the term relates not to an event. Let me say that again, not to an event, but to divine revelation recorded in written form within a narrative framework. I'll just say that again. The term does not relate to a single event or even a number of events, but to a divine revelation recorded in written form within a narrative framework. The work employs a manner of communication and expression that is veiled, that is to say, covered or concealed to those who do not have a background for understanding what is being presented. So if you're not familiar, or the reader was not familiar with the allusions to the Old Testament, to the social and cultural milieu that they were living in, religious expressions and tensions that they lived within, it can be pretty meaningless. It sounds a bit like a science fiction or a fantasy novel, something like that. But apocalyptic writings have got very, very deep meanings, and they had a purpose. Apocalyptic works could be encouraged as tracts of encouragement to those under persecution at the time that they lived in. And it would be written in this veiled form so to keep this information away from those who didn't understand it, or those who read it and didn't understand it would not be able to use it as a tool for persecution. Okay. In contrast to many biblical documents, usually, and this is unusual, the genre did not develop from oral forms. Now, this is very interesting because in the rest of biblical writings, they invariably developed in oral forms, oral transmissions. Some became stylized and formalized in the genre of oral history before they became written, revised, redacted, and we've got the final versions we enjoy today. So the genre did not develop from oral forms, hence a more highly stylized and schematized way of writing. In other words, apocalyptic writings do not have spontaneity, they have deliberation. So basically, there are two kinds of apocalypses. Two kinds. Firstly, those containing otherworldly journeys, which involve the seer, who sees, literally, being raised above the sensible world, into the heavens, or looking from above. The apocalypses of Adam, Setel, Enosh, Shem, and the very famous Enoch are examples of these kind of works. We could also mention Paul's journey into the third heaven. Yeah, looking down and seeing this heavenly journey, visited the third heaven. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 to 10. Those are the leading example. Secondly, apocalypses can be presented as a historical survey in which the seer has a vision concerned with the developments leading to the end of history, sometimes known as the end of the age or the day of the Lord. So those are the two types of apocalypse that we get to read in Hebrew and then related Greek literature. As the leading scholar in this area, J.J. Collins, importantly points out, there is a necessary transcendent element in all apocalypses. There has to be transcendent, otherwise become mundane. God is presumed to work outside the events of present history rather than through them. I want you to take notes of this when we come on to the next two sessions. So I don't want to be repetitive gratuitously, but I do want to say this again. God is presumed to work outside of the events of present history rather than through them. Such an approach is helpful to recipients as it may help to sustain faith in a community that is expecting an interventionist God to abruptly bring an immediate end to the present suffering. So we know in the 2nd century the church was under suspicion and persecution and was pronounced religio illicita, an illegal religion, which brought about suffering and martyrdom. It might be interesting sometime to do a session on martyrdom in the present age, and I think we'll all be surprised what we find when we start digging in that particular well. It should be emphasized in apocalyptic writing the hope is centered in the anticipated and awaited messianic kingdom. Therefore, it's useful to realize at the outset that in Judaism, the emphasis lies in the messianic kingdom as much as, and on occasion, more than the messianic figure who comes to inaugurate the kingdom. Now, the kingdom of God, at the time of apocalyptic writings, the kingdom of God happens within the Jewish identity, election, and calling. Architectonically, sequences of numbers, people, or events are common features. In scholarship, we refer to them as part of the common stock of apocalyptic images. Numbers mostly hold symbolic values or may be used as encryptions. You've got to realise, of course, at the time of these writings, maths was a very, very different thing to it today, and particularly Hebrew mathematics, they use letters of the alphabet. So our eschatological teacher friends, with all their charts and great mathematical schemes, are actually living in a completely different world to that these writings were written in and the audiences that they were intended for. The writings contain symbolic pictures of things that should be recognised as dangerous warnings, things that should be getting ready prepared for the forces of evil operating, things that will remind them that even though God is outside of the sensible world, all things ultimately are in his hand. It's very interesting to read the works of rabbinic scholars when they speak about the end of the days. Their views are very different to the Christian ones, and they put much more emphasis on individual responsibility. So that's a very brief introduction, and we'll take a break, and then we come back. We'll tie this up so I have a really good understanding of what we're going to read when we read scriptures that are cast in the apocalyptic genre.
If you are a Christian, then there is no question that you owe a great debt to the Jewish people. Unto them were entrusted the oracles of God. What does that mean? It means, if not for the faithfulness of the Jewish people, we would not have this. And therefore you would not know your God, and you would not know his Son.
Israel and the Jewish people are under attack right now, and we owe them everything. The least that we can do is support them in their hour of need. So please go to EzraInternational.org and give to the Emergency Relief Fund, and your dollars will be used to help displaced and traumatized Jewish people throughout the land.
And remember, if you do nothing, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jewish people from another place. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. please go to EzraInternational.org and give your best gift today.
Welcome back. It's important when dealing with apocalyptic writings not to confuse the categories being employed by running them together. Neither should the visions and symbols be pressed into allegorical interpretation that demands that every detail has some independent spiritual meaning. So, in other words, we've spoken about allegorical interpretations before, particularly Noah's Ark and Augustine, where the wood is the wood of the cross, the door's the hole inside of Jesus. In other words, every single word has to have some spiritual meaning that relates directly to Jesus, because the meaning may be singly contained in the whole vision. Now, we need to understand this. I want to say this very clearly. There's a massive difference between Hebrew thought and Greek thought, or I'm going to call it Western thought. And there are two kinds of philosophical, historical, theological ways or views. The Hebrew one is block logic, where the development of what's happening is a whole story, and it must be looked at as a whole, not linear development or line by line. To read this, it's a line and walk along it. Hebrew thought it's a block. You live in the whole thing. Yeah? The beginning, the end, the up, the down, the middle, all looked at as one thing, not a lot of individual things. And when we go to look in Revelation at Gog and Magog, and when we start looking at Armageddon, and when we look at various other things in Revelation that seem maybe out of sequence, sequential development is not part of Hebrew thought. It's how the idea is a whole thing, and it's not necessarily important that it goes from A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It doesn't matter if it goes A to D and then back to C, for instance. Let's just bear that in mind as we go along. Apocalyptic writings are designed to impact the reader. They're written for effect, far more than deep navel-gazing or looking for deep spiritual elements that aren't there. One should bear in mind, particularly when approaching the book of Revelation, that in common with other apocalyptic writings, it is not a detailed plan of the future. Its primary purpose is to encourage those that are reading. It's not a roadmap to the end of times. Apocalypses were written to encourage, to impact, to encourage, raise action, possibly, but most of all to strengthen. A useful phrase to help the understanding of apocalyptic writings is to remember this: they're historically conditioned, but theologically orientated. That's a quote of my own, okay? Historically conditioned, but theologically orientated. So the apocalypse is used as an exchange term in some circles for the canonical book of Revelation. The term apocalyptic discourse is also coined to describe Mark 13, Matthew 24, and Luke 21, where notices relate to the teachings of Jesus concerning the fall of Jerusalem and the end of the age. But before moving on any further, it's probably worth defining the terms apocalypse and apocalypticism. That last one's a little bit of a tongue twister, isn't it? So an apocalypse is literary genre form, the kind of literature in which apocalyptic views are expressed. Apocalypticism is the worldview of an apocalyptic movement or group. And as we know, there have been many of these over the years. We can go back to the days of the early church and the Montanists. We can look at the suicide cults in America in the early 20th century, middle of the 20th century. That's apocalypticism. Okay. So the genre grew and developed during the Second Temple period, drawing on many of the previous writings that were available at the time. So at the time of writing, the genres come really back into focus again with all the conflicts in the Middle East. Many motifs contained in the Book of Revelation are misunderstood by modern readers when they encounter them within the canonical literature. Apocalyptic literature really was something of a Cinderella subject until the earlier 20th century. It was only an increased interest arose from the writings of Jonathan Weiss and Albert Schweitzer, I'm sure you've all heard of, maybe not as a theologian, but certainly as a medical missionary. Albert Schweitzer's very famous book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus, brought forth the importance of apocalyptic literature, and the great theologian of the 20th century, Karl Barth, stated that if Christianity is not seen as altogether and thoroughly eschatological, our preacher's got no relationship with Christ. More recently, one of my favourite theologians, Wolfhart Pannenberg, used eschatology as the main point of explication for his theological writings. Pannenberg said all theological questions and answers have meaning only within the framework of the history which God has with humanity. In other words, eschatology is a relational dimension between God and humanity. This is with the whole creation directed towards a future which is hidden to the world but is already revealed, and I'll put the word nascently in there, in Messiah. Another great scholar, Ernst Caseman, said that apocalypticism was the mother of all Christian theology, since we cannot class the preaching of Jesus as theology, it's eschatology. This all starts with Schweitzer, who believed that to find the historical Jesus and to understand his teaching, you'd have to understand Jesus as a preacher of eschatology. Hence, one of the reasons he spoke in parables, or more correctly, mashals, some kind of thing. There we go. One of the great experts on this writing, R.H. Charles, referred to the apocalyptic as the parent of Christianity. And the controlling factor, D. Freeman says, is a controlling factor of the New Testament, which of course is quite correct. I mean, I've never heard anybody say that from the pulpit, but it does drive, because the whole Christ advent, his whole teaching, his ministry, the development of the church and the message of the gospel all lead to one thing, don't they? Which is the day of the Lord, the end of the turn, and the kingdom being realised. Isn't it wonderful? The apocalyptic found its place in arts and literature. In recent times, Jewish messianic apocalyptic motifs appeared in poetic words by Irving Feldman, Jack Hirschman, John Hollander, David Meltzer, and Jerome Rothenberg. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with their writings. It's probably good to look as apocalyptic writings, when we read them, as a sign of the hope that we're given in Messiah. It's not possible to accept the New Testament proclamation concerning the relationship of God and history without accepting in principle the related witness of the prophets and the apocalypse. And this also holds true for non-canonical writings. So, we may consider the apocalyptic genre to be a response to times of crisis, designed to bring assurance to God's people. So the book of Revelation, it sits in Laban, in its place in time, history, culture, theology, and everything else, was designed exactly for that reason, to bring hope for the present and hope for the future. The great theologian Jürgen Moltmann wrote a wonderful book which he entitled The Theology of Hope, pointing out that the whole mission and the whole ministry, time, life and death of Jesus was to bring hope to us. But let's remember that the primary thrust of this was to bring hope to the Jewish people. And if we talk about bringing hope to Christians, we can say that as well. In the time it was written in, the church was still Jewish. Paul had a different kind of slant on things, but he still held to the traditional teaching in the Tanakh, but more so John. I've always found it rather ironic that John is presented as a massively anti-Semitic and very Greek and very light document. Yet, in my opinion, it isn't. I'll go with J.T. Robinson, who, in his seminal book, Redating the New Testament, argues that all New Testament documents, at least in their nascent form, were in some sort of circulation before the form of the temple. And the logic in that is quite simple. There's not a single writing in the New Testament that describes the fall of the temple, what happened immediately afterwards. And the fall of the temple was the greatest disaster that could befall the Jewish people. As I said, 68% of Revelation, 68% are allusions to Old Testament, and particularly Ezekiel. And if we look at a lot of those allusions and we bring them into the overall picture, then we're going to find that God has not finished with the Jewish people. He is giving them hope and a future. Remember those wonderful words of Jeremiah: to prosper you and not for evil, to give you a hope and a future. But sadly, from Justin onwards, and from Revelation, became widely circulated. The Jewish people were excised out of it. The Jewish people got no hope and no future. But the gospel is to the Jew first. And we have responsibilities as heirs. We have responsibilities as those that are grafted in to understand these writings of Revelation and other apocalypses, and to know that God wants the Jewish people to be strengthened and to reach their destiny. So let us labour while it's still day, for night's coming when no one can work. And let's heed the apocalyptic writings. Let's heed the warnings. Let's be prepared, and let's be encouraged, and let's be strengthened. So, in the meantime, God be with you until we meet again to discuss Gog and Magog and Revelation.